On August 25th, 2021, at exactly 9 a.m., I attended my first college class. The name of the class was Political Questions, but now it's simply known as PPE 110, which stands for Philosophy, Politics, and Economics. It is the introductory course for the political economy major, or PPE major, which also happens to be my major. So it made sense that out of all the classes I attended that semester, that was the one class I was most excited for. We talked about different political systems and their relationship with all of the other economic systems, and in an attempt to answer life's biggest philosophical questions. What is justice? What is equality? What does it mean to be equal, and who's responsible for ensuring that equality, among so many other things? So believing when I tell you that class surpassed all of my expectations. Obviously, that was partly due to its content, but I am 100% sure that it was also because of the man, the architect, the professor behind it all. He's been a professor at Rhodes College since 1994, but he's been teaching since 1984. He holds a PhD in government from Cornell University, and his dissertation was actually nominated for the prestigious Leo Strauss Prize of the American Political Science Association. He has published articles, essays, and co-authored the book, The Invention of the United States Senate, with the professor and also his younger brother, Stephen Wirls, and is currently working on a book about politics, religion, Shakespeare, and Machiavelli. So without further ado, Professor Stephen Wirls, welcome to the Octagon of Reason.
Well, thank you for having me, Kelton.
Again, I was telling Professor Wirls right before we started that I've been, I envisioned this for about 6 months now, and I always had him as my first guest. So again, thank you so much for accepting my invitation. It's wonderful to have you here, sir. So I think for starters, right, before we start talking about all these different abstract things that we always talk about, I want to know about Professor Wirls, Stephen Wirls, the man before he became the professor. I remember last year, around this time last year, you used to tell us that we were brought up in a family of five, I believe, 5 boys.
4 boys, one girl.
Yeah, 4 boys and 1 girl, and you were a very naughty kid, right? And that was always hard to picture because I know you as Professor Wirls. So why don't you walk us back? How did you go from being a naughty kid and then being Professor Stephen Wirls? How was your background? How was growing up in your day?
Well, I mean, I grew up, I was sort of happy, lucky to have a stable family. Again, there were 5 kids. That gives you a lot of companionship. And we were pretty strong companions when we were really young. And sort of as we split up, as we went off to college or whatever, those bonds loosened and then they tightened up again. And we're very close now.
Mm-hmm.
We're all over the place. We have one in Alaska, one in California, one in Montana, one in Memphis, Tennessee, and one in New York City. So
that's great.
Yeah, we visit through Zoom. But I was not. You said this. I mean, I was not a particularly good kid. Kind of juvenile delinquency, I guess you would say. I was sort of happy to be rebellious, and it didn't matter what it was. It tended to be my father. He said yes, I said no, and that's just the way we got along, which wasn't all that well. When I got into high school, I had a sort of focus for my rebellion, which is no longer against my father, but I had a kind of anti-authority side to me. And, so now I had school principals to fight and things like that. College was Kenyan. I loved Kenyan. I was kind of mixed up, but it was a good education. probably is the reason I'm here now, in the
Mm.
sense that when I went to graduate school, you know, I knew that if I came out and decided to be, you know, a professor, that I would want to teach at a place like Kenya, a small place. And I feel extremely grateful. I feel like my whole professional life has been lucky. Um, and so let me thank Professor Dan Cullen for bringing me here.
He's
And
my advisor, actually. Yeah.
you know, then, you know, it's a great place to be. And obviously I wanted to stay and have stayed. You know, I would, you know, when I don't know how far you want me to go with this, but
No. I think I want to backtrack for a little bit here because you
Sure.
said that, you were sort of happy for, for being a rebellious kid. So like what exactly triggered that? Like was it anything about growing up in a large family that maybe you wanted to stand out, and maybe the best way to do that was, by being rebellious? Or like what exactly triggered your, you know that disposition from you?
I don't have an explanation.
Okay.
Help me, except maybe, you know, I was the middle child and everyone says the middle child has problems. So maybe that's it.
Yeah.
But it was pretty ingrained, you know, starting obviously at, you know, more closer to adolescence than before that. But yeah, it was the way I was. And,
Mhm.
you know, and it's changed. I mean, I still am to some degree, but
You think so?
the focus has changed. Yeah.
Okay.
It changed really in graduate school, where, you know, I felt there were some pretty, I can't go into details,
Mhm.
partly because it would take the entire hour to explain everything.
Okay.
But it's where I kind of faced, what would you call it, sort of righteous, ideological righteousness that was harming people.
Hmm.
And, you know, what I thought were sort of unscrupulous people. And, you know, so it wasn't a rebellion exactly against authority any longer. It was a rebellion against, you know, people who harmed good people. You know?
Okay.
And it required, I'm not patting myself on the back seriously, but it taught me sort of more about what I would call moral courage.
Okay.
Because, you know, by the time I left graduate school, there weren't many people talking to me any longer. You know, because, you know, I fought what they were trying to do, and they were so rigid about it that anyone who, you know, raised problems, whatever, questioned things, supported what they thought was the wrong side, uh, you know, they thought
It-
I was bad and therefore worthy of being sort of shunned. And, you know, again, I don't want to exaggerate,
yeah, I see
but
what you're saying.
it takes a lot to not have people talk to you
But,
in your,
but, but if you're saying that, by the time you left graduate school, you pretty much didn't have anybody talking to you. So I'm assuming you were kind of by yourself on your stances.
there
So
were,
yeah,
there were
if that's the case, sorry to interrupt you, but if that's the case, how did you, like, what sort of asserted your views if you were, by yourself? Because I know it's easier to I know you talk about moral courage, right? But I know it's easier to stand for what you believe in if you have other people around you to do the same. But if you were by yourself, like, who were you seeing? Who were you seeing back then that was doing what you were doing? Like, where did that moral courage sort of emerge from?
well, I don't know. I mean, it was, you know, I guess I just thought that someone was being terribly treated, that these people surrounding me, my fellow graduate students,
Mm.
were either, you know, sort of vicious, in, you know, what they were trying to do and how they treated other people. And other people were quiet, who
Mm.
wouldn't defend, you know, the people who were being harmed. I wasn't alone, there were a couple other people, but actually coming out and fighting and saying the things that I thought need to be said, it's kind of put me front and center. But I guess it's not easy, but there's a kind of good feeling in the confidence you have, not in being right, but in opposing those who are doing what was, to me, clearly wrong. And I just learned something about myself through that, and it sort of gets at what you were asking, Kelton, and that is that I can do just fine by myself. I can, I like friends. I'm a shy person, but not, I'm still social. But if the circumstances require it, you just put up with it. But there was one professor who was very supportive, and that made a big difference. Just someone's office I could go to, and we could, talk things through, or not talk about them at all, and just, talk about Immanuel Kant or something like that. At least.
Was he your Professor Wirls in a way?
Well, I don't know, Kelton. In a way, yeah. He was very important to me. Both because he was probably on the top 3 smartest people I know, which was always humbling to be with him always. And he was pretty good at reminding you that you should be humble. But he was, it was just someone to talk to, took things seriously, both that were going on at the university and things that were, important that we needed to talk about. So that helped.
Sorry to cut you, sir. A thought just came to mind that it's funny that you just said that it was important for you to stand for what you believe in. I don't know if this was intentional or not, but I don't know if you remember, but our first class was actually, we had to watch the video from Charles Murray from his, unsuccessful attempts to deliver a speech, a keynote speech at Middlebury, if I'm not mistaken, right? Yep. So, and that was actually our first class. So was that, when you're trying to set the tone for how you wanted our class to look like? What was because, we never actually talked about that ever again, but it was just that first class, that's what we talked about. So, no, I'm trying to relate to what you just said. What was the rationale? What was the idea behind that?
Well, that's it's complicated, but it sort of was a quick way to get to, how I teach my courses, which is not unrelated to what we were just talking about, because one of, a couple of the things I came away with from Cornell is a kind of clear understanding of how complicated things were. When I was at Cornell, I was liberal left. That whole experience changed me because I became very skeptical of human nature. Humans can be just such beautiful creatures. They can love each other, they can care for each other, they can sacrifice for each other, but we can also be terrible creatures, selfish, vicious. And, in a sense, I thought, that my kind of liberal left views sort of rested on the idea, a kind of idealism about human beings. And that went away. Because I saw people who I thought I agreed with, people on the liberal left, who were horrid. So I kind of came to the conclusion that, people and things are more complicated. And that, in some ways, this is wandering back to, as it takes me sometimes a while to get back to the question itself. But that's kind of how I teach my courses, is that things are complicated. That the Charles Murray is a good example. I mean, he's written many things that are controversial, but our task is to face them and inquire, argue with, but you can't argue with something that you don't listen to. And start shutting things out, then you lose. So does everybody else. I mean, that was the sort of great shame of that whole fiasco, was that people who wanted to hear him, whether they agreed with him or not, couldn't. And, that means possibly many people were deprived of something that could have advanced their understanding of the world, even if that came from, arguing with Charles Murray, learning more things about him and by him that, clarified one's views that he's wrong about something. That's a benefit. So yes, that is, sort of what I want to do in that course and in all my courses, is to sort of present the complexity of things. Why it's very, very hard to have a clear, unqualified view of social, political, moral questions. They're just complicated. So my aim, as a teacher, is to present them in their complications. And I know that annoys everybody at some point. That's my aim, at least. I want everyone in the class, unless they're just, completely not thinking, and I haven't had one of those students, so that people will be disturbed by something because it upsets their way of looking at the world. So I've sort of come to be happier with the complexity, not giving up trying to find answers, but not giving up being frustrated by not finding them.
Maybe 2 months or so after that Charles Murray lecture, the one we had in class, we had an incident, if I may put it that way, with Peter Singer, the philosopher. He was scheduled to give a talk, I think, about the ethics of pandemics, something like that, something related about pandemics, right? And as soon as the news went out that, hey, Rhodes College under the philosophy department is hosting Peter Singer, everybody just went wild, right? I wasn't even aware of who Peter Singer was. I didn't know what his views were. And I think, I want to say, I'm almost sure that most of the people who were complaining about him were not aware of his views as well. Because I had conversations with friends of mine, and I remember my roommate asking me, why wasn't I angry about the situation? And I quite frankly, I told him, I don't know this guy, right? And if I knew him, I think this would be an opportunity to know what it is about. And if I don't agree with him, that's also an opportunity to go against him and just go back and forth, because I believe that this is what universities are for. So you've been in academia for almost 40 years now. How did you assess the entire situation? Were you surprised by it, or not at all? Okay, would you like to say more about that?
Well, it just happens so often now. It's distressing. But the parallel between Singer and Murray is perfect, in the sense that Murray was coming to talk about his recent research, which was on chronic poverty. It was studying, he wanted to get rid of it, make a point and get rid of sort of the race and ethnic. So he just studied, we talked about this in class. He studied, white people and rich and poor. And he came to some very interesting conclusions about poverty and what the causes are. And that's what he wanted to talk about, not his old, earlier ideas that came from a book called The Bell Curve that was about the genetic basis of intelligence. So they were protesting something he wasn't going to talk about. So they were shielding people, not, from the ideas they thought, they wanted to. Same with Singer. He was coming to talk about, sort of COVID and how do you deal with an epidemic and what are the kind of moral considerations. Not his stuff on, which had to do with people.
Infanticide.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the subject matter is people born with defects of some sort, psychological, physical. And how do we deal with that? And Singer's a utilitarian. I'm not, but he is. I disagree with a lot of things he says. I think, humans have a kind of innate dignity. He deals it's not that he doesn't, but his utilitarianism is based on pain, reducing suffering. And so all of his arguments about giving your money away, which he's very much for, is about suffering, relieving suffering in the world. So his whole argument about, that led to the sort of infanticide charges is about reducing suffering. It's not, doesn't arise from some kind of indifference or cruelty. It arises from a great sensitivity. That's why he's a vegetarian. He may be a vegan. I can't remember.
Yeah, he is a vegan too. He is.
Yeah, I mean, he just doesn't like the way we treat animals because he sees them as sentient beings. They have at least pain, and that we cause pain by the way we raise them and slaughter them, etc. So, yeah, I know, but I'm not surprised. I mean, this sort of things happen on most college campuses now as people get kind of whipped up about something and they don't necessarily read, but they certainly then don't listen. And I think that's a problem.
What do you think is causing that, sir? Because I ask myself that all the time.
Well, boy, Kelton, if I could answer that definitively, I would be a rich person. But no, it's sort of, I think there's been a kind of shift in academic life from a sort of sense of scholarly responsibility and therefore a certain degree of humility that goes with that. It's difficult to know enough, whatever your subject matter is. And there are still many, many people here and elsewhere who embrace that as a principle that they seek to understand, and they understand that they don't understand everything. Exactly. This goes from biologists through English professors, political science professors. So it's not a disease that infects the entire college or ever could be a university, but there does seem to be less humility and more certainty about the sort of validity of feelings, and that it's. And again, I can't really explain in any way that would even convince me the origin of that, but that's certainly what the surface is. The surface is that being offended is a feeling, and it's sufficient to sort of validate my position that X shouldn't be around, that it's more, which is sort of, seems to me very contrary to the purpose of a college or university where reason and evidence should dominate. And it's come more to kind of feelings, and being offended, being hurt now becomes sort of the trump card that Donald Trump. And, it sort of wins out over any kind of rational discourse, any kind of evidence, that it doesn't really matter whether there's a good reason to be offended. It doesn't really matter that being offended is probably the easiest thing for human beings to do. We are so good at it.
Yeah.
Any human being who inspects his life just that much will find that he or she has exaggerated some harm way beyond what it really is. So we're really good at it. And it's, it seems to me precisely the job of a college and university to ask students to set that aside. Not to be without feelings, but to set it aside in the sense like an awareness that what I feel or think at the moment may be very, very far from what makes most sense when we look at what's relevant to it, that. So there's again, go back to that word, which I like very much in an academic context, is humility, that I can know more than other people, but I am still humble before my complete knowledge of that I don't know a lot of things. And so, I can be confident in certain matters, but I can't be confident that I have the whole or even a large portion of the truth. That's why I said, I teach with the idea of complexity in mind, not answers. Let's look at all the different answers, and we'll see that they're not compatible. Now, how do we sort that out?
Do you think there's always a right answer to these things? I understand the importance of, exposing people to different ideas, right? Especially when it comes to complex issues like the ones we talked about in class. But do you think there's always a right answer to the things we talk about, or at least an answer there's righter than others in a way? Yeah. Yeah.
Well, the answer to your first question is, I would like to believe there are right answers. I read and think as if there is that final goal. Am I there? No. Do I expect to get there on the big questions? God, justice. Nah, I'm not going to get there. But there are righter answers. Yes, there are ones that comport more with the evidence, so whether the evidence is factual evidence, experimental evidence, obviously scientists arrive at pretty definitive conclusions, but most scientists I know also think, well, maybe the next experiment will show something different, or the next batch of data will show something different. But I do think that, one can reason one's way to more thorough answers, ones that comport most with what we can see in the world around us. So, yes, I think, over the years, I've made progress toward what you call righter answers. And I agree. There are better and worse ones. There are ones that fall apart upon examination. And then, you move on to what you've learned from that. And then hopefully incorporate more and more complexity until you have, and in each step, greater confidence that you must be closer, because you have not dismissed things, but rather brought them in. More things, more understanding of human beings, etc., which is, the focus of most of my work is trying to understand human beings, which, what a mess.
What a mess. What a mess, for sure. Your answer kind of reminds me of the allegory of the cave. I'm not sure if this is a good comparison, because And you also talked about how the more you try to reason your way through life, the more lonely you became. And I think it's a good, when you look at, the allegory of the cave, it sort of represents that in so many ways. And actually, I kind of view the way you structured your class, as the allegory of the cave in a way, as we, the students, are the ones who are, in the cave, and you, as the one who was able to finally break free, and you sort of going back and forth with us when it comes to all these different issues. Would you say that, with having that image of the allegory in mind, would you say that you've been, more often than not, you've been successful at trying to guide us, to the light, trying to show us that the things we're seeing are just mere, projections, and the real things, right? For you to be able to actually see the real things, there's more work to be done. Would you say that you've been successful in that throughout the years?
I'm not the person to ask. My students are.
Or maybe let me put it this way: how would you measure the success of guiding your students? Maybe that's a better question. How would you measure that success?
I mean, I would say that in most classes, one does see progress in the sense of greater awareness of the larger world, that
Okay.
there are a lot more out there in the social, political, and moral world than they have taken into consideration before. And that sort of you see this where the daily writings, Kelton, that you see this in the daily writings, is that they just get more and more complicated with a lot of students, because they've incorporated more subtle understandings of things. So, I mean, we can go to the cave. I'm nowhere near out of the cave. I do want, my aim is to turn heads around, like Plato talks, and maybe take a couple steps. I can't expect to do more than that. But also, I'm not sure, I know this will sound bad, but I'm not sure where I'm leading you. That's my kind of hesitation about teaching certain things. Is I haven't been out of the cave, honestly, given my sort of philosophical bent. I'm not sure there is a sun out there in the Platonic sense, a final metaphysical truth of things. I'm not so sure that's the right account of what we know and how we know it. But so, there's a kind of high responsibility to teaching, because you need to be aware that you have an influence on people, and you have to be aware that that influence could go badly if you kind of turn somebody's head around but don't give them anything to kind of stand on, to keep thinking. And, I worry about that all the time, but that so I want to open people's eyes, but I do not want to destroy things that are important to them. I want them to think about them, but my aim is not to undermine things that are important to people. So I want them to think about them really hard. Maybe see that there are problems with their views, hopefully see their problems. But, if I can't be there at the end of the line, to support them when, their whole belief system has collapsed, then I have a responsibility to be careful about that, be careful, So that's why so many of my courses are sort of on the one hand, on the other hand. So on the one hand, might affirm some people. On the other hand, might trouble them, but affirm other people. But if they both have to see both, and then, I do want people to come away, to go back to an earlier question you asked. I do want people to come away with a kind of humility about their understanding of things, that maybe I don't know everything or have everything. But I don't want to, my aim is not to destroy, people's view of the world. So, because I can't pick up the pieces if I do that. I won't be around to do that.
Mhm.
It's a serious responsibility.
Would you say, was there anything that was once very important to you, any view that was once very important to you that along the way, in your quest for greater understanding of the world and human beings, that got destroyed?
Well, Kelton, I was a Marxist, so
Okay. Say no more. Say no more then. Yeah.
fair. I'll give you a couple. One of them's sort of personal, but I'll only wade into that so far. But yeah, I was very left wing. I'm sort of a Marxist. I was a stupid one. I didn't really understand Marx that well, but and it was pretty clear to me after a while, both giving up on this kind of idealistic understanding of human beings, that they can all of a sudden be perfectly good people. That's an exaggeration, but also just, it's grotesque failures, and, and where supposedly there was communism, and the obvious fact that in the most advanced industrial nations, which should have been the ones that had communist revolutions, they haven't had communist revolutions. They built middle classes, which is entirely contrary to Marx. So I just feel like, that side, the kind of economic side of Marx, I gave up on. But I mean, I can have a kind of dumpster in my office of all the things I've eventually abandoned. But and a lot of that has to do with something we went back, talked about earlier, and that is kind of a skepticism about human beings, and sort of not getting rid of ideals. I would like life to be better, but I am very skeptical of any plan that rests on making people better. Free people, they will be complicated, and they will have, selfishness. They will be all sorts of things. So there's a limited degree to which you can make society and politics good. And one of the things I've learned from reading history is that when people try to make society perfect and good, many people die. And that's something that's, helped change my mind about various things. So
I want to poke you a little bit more on this one, because you said that as much as you want to guide people towards having a greater understanding of the world, you also do not want to destroy things that are very, very dear to them, right? So let's assume that you have a student, right, who's also a Marxist, right? And your belief is that, first of all, back in your days when you considered yourself a Marxist, you didn't really understand what Marxism was all about. So, and once you actually understood what it was about, you realize how, in your view, it was very harmful to people, right? So if you have a student that is a diehard Marxist, right? Why wouldn't you go out of your way? I'm not saying to impose your view, right? But to try to make it more salient, I may say, maybe that's the best word, salient in that person's mind, that maybe this is not the best way to look at the world, right? Instead of just, shying away from, quote unquote, destroying your worldview.
Yeah. Well, I mean, wouldn't consider someone who's a Marxist, I wouldn't consider that to be something sort of deeply personal. Those are the one things that I worry about, that I'm going to, get to something, sort of that's kind of part of their being. But, no, I would think that's my job. It would be to sort of point out the complications with Marxist understanding of human nature. He doesn't, at least in one version of Marx, he doesn't think there's a human nature.
Mhm.
That would be part of the argument. Haven't we seen the same characteristics in human beings, throughout the ages? And, the other thing I would point out, which I do point out, is that, his understanding of the trajectory of capitalism seems to have been very wrong. There's no economic system in the history of the world, based on the data I've looked at, that has done more to relieve human misery than free market capitalism. And those are the kind of things we start pointing out. Person still may be a Marxist, but hopefully a more thoughtful one. Maybe realizing, well, it isn't so simple. Capitalism bad. We have to get rid of. My students talk about this. Oh, capitalism is based on greed. Well, it's not. It's based on selfishness. Those aren't the same thing. Every one of them and every person wants to make his or her life more comfortable, better. That's selfish. Doesn't mean you step on people. It just means you want your life, your family, your kids to have a better life, a good life. And so you get rid of the kind as much as possible, the sort of good, evil, simply good, evil. Things are all a little more complicated. So, whether I could, change somebody's mind and give them, get them to sort of give up Marxism, it's not really my aim, but I would like to plant seeds of doubt. And there's plenty of reason for that doubt. So I would, and I would convey that as these are the things I saw that changed my mind. But, they're more personal things that, that I worry about touching on in a way that I can't, that undermine in a way that I can't fix, if it's a problem.
I'm glad you actually made the distinction between selfishness and greed, because oftentimes people tend to equate these two concepts the same way they equate inequality with injustice, right? Just because something is unequal, that doesn't necessarily mean that is unjust or unfair. And I think that's, more often than not, that's how most people look at capitalism or look at the world in general. Oh, there's inequality. There are people who are obviously smarter than others, more talented than others. And when you add all those filters into the job market, you realize that some people end up making more money than others, right? And that creates, an inequality. But just because that exists doesn't necessarily mean that that hierarchy is based on, injustice or some sort of oppression, right? How do you try to explain that to college students? Because I think I see that line of thought more predominant amongst college students, right? Which is kind of weird, because you would expect college students to be more open to, to dig out the truth for themselves, but that's not really the case. So how do you explain them that just because there's inequality in the world, it doesn't necessarily mean that the system or, things are necessarily unfair?
Well, I think, the first step is to point out to them that, unless you're willing to give away half of, 90% of what you own, then you're not serious about inequality. It's easy to talk about it, but do something about it, which means, be willing to give up most of what you have, in order to even things out. And, most people recognize, all right, can't do that. or won't do that, then, get them to realize that here they are. Well, this is another example I use. If people are really serious about equality, then college admissions should be run as a lottery, which means everyone throws his or her name in a big hat, and Harvard gets to pick a name, and then Yale picks a name, and then Rhodes picks a name, and you go. And all the students are distributed around colleges and universities entirely randomly.
Mm.
That would be an equal system.
Mm-hmm.
I have yet to have a student who said, yes, let's do that.
Mm.
You see this all the time. So, that helps get the discussion on a more serious level, And that means, sort of get back to what you were saying, is what we need to do is look at what counts as an injustice.
Mm.
Is someone harming another person? That's an injustice. That's what the law thinks an injustice is. It has to be someone harming somebody else. And it's hard to talk about. I'm not sure, I can't really even wrap my head around an idea that somehow there's a system out there that generates these inequalities and that's an injustice. Because there's so many factors that go into unequal outcomes, and a lot of those are choices. People make choices. A lot of it's the lottery of just, families, that some kids, I was brought up in a family that both my mother and father were college educated. My father had a PhD. They both read. Huge advantage to me. I acknowledge that, absolutely. It kind of organized my sense of my future. And someone may be born in circumstances that are nowhere near that. I would think we should have policies to reduce those differences as much as possible, but I would not call them an injustice. No one is harming another person. It's circumstances. And so we want to alleviate poverty. We want to do all sorts of things, that get at the roots of poverty. But we're not doing it because there's an injustice. We're doing it because we think human beings ought to have a better shot at life, ought to have the choices in front of them that allow them to make dumb choices and better choices. But, put people in the circumstances as close as we can. And education is a crucial one. Family structure is a big one that affects people's life chances. And let's do what we can to improve those. But calling it an injustice just doesn't get us any close. You got to get down to what causes this and that as much as we can understand it and try to fix those. But, calling it all this sort of vague sort of sense of systemic or systematic
racism, that's
whatever
oppression, inequality, that's what they say.
It moves us away from understanding the origins of problems and how we can solve them and make them better, ameliorate the problems. And so that's what I would want to focus on. Forget the justice question at that level. And let's just go about thinking how to step by step, this problem, that problem in a very methodical and practical way. If you call the whole system unjust, then there's only one way to fix it, and that's to get rid of the system, whatever it is. That's a revolution. I'm not big on revolutions. A lot of people die in revolutions. They often turn out very badly. I would like, that's why I'm a big fan of sort of prudence, do what you can. aim at the good. You won't get there, but do the practical steps that get you as close to that good outcome as you want.
Mhm.